Let's start with Erikson's theory. Take a moment and decide what should go in that blank. Psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, psychosexual, psychosocial. Certainly one of those. Hopefully you're saying loudly, psychosocial. Now, as a review of his first stage, and I'll pause a moment here so you can think. Hopefully you're leaning towards trust versus mistrust based on the parents' or caretakers' behaviors. Learning to trust that your caretakers are predictable. The world, your needs will be met predictably. The world is predictable versus mistrust in your safety, your needs being met, the people around you, and so on. It starts early in the first year of life. In this chapter, we'll focus on the two stages that are corresponding to early childhood, autonomy versus shame and doubt, and initiative versus guilt. We should also note, of course, that since the stage early childhood goes to 2 to 6, and autonomy stage is year 2, it straddles both the previous chapter, infancy and toddlerhood, that is the toddlerhood part of it, and early childhood. So both partially repeat, which is probably still very good if you're learning it for our test too. Many of the great psychologists worked through their entire life, so the pictures we associate with them are typically in very late adulthood. I did enjoy finding one in the age side of this slide showing a still older but still vigorous Erik Erikson. So just as it would be impossible, if not reasonable, to skip Piaget for cognitive development, we similarly have to do Erikson for the socio-emotional development. Now, Erikson, we've covered the previous stage before because it straddles the infancy and toddlerhood age, but it also is for part of our early childhood, since early childhood is age 2, and the autonomy versus shame and doubt also straddles this. So let's just do a quick review. So autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy means they can do for themselves. So they're trying to do new things, whether it's put their own food in their mouth, though it might land more in their face, in their lap, in the table than in their mouth, but trying to do things on their own versus shame when they do badly or doubt they can do it at all. Stage 2 issues. Stage 2 is initiative versus guilt. They're doing many new things. So, and it's building on the previous stage of autonomy, of course. So they're doing many new things, but may not sure when they should or do, or maybe they're overdoing some things that they should not, things that are dangerous. Guilt over possible bad outcomes, guilt over failure, maybe guilt over not doing something like, why aren't you dressed yet? We're leaving, or what have you. So the goal would be find a balance between what that child can do and should do versus providing structure so they don't extend themselves too far to do something that's too risky, either psychologically maybe or dangerously. So obviously the parent can't let the child do everything they want at any age, especially this age. So just to maybe stir up memories from previous modules or even courses. So Erikson was a student of whom? And what was his orientation? Psycho something. And clearly he's a stage theorist. So does that mean he has a continuous or a discontinuous viewpoint of development? So see if you can answer those 3 questions before you go on. So hopefully the questions I just posed were moderately easy, or at least hopefully most of them were. So Erikson, definitely one of Freud's inner circle. Unlike Freud, who had a psychosexual orientation, Erikson whose emphasis was, of course, socio-emotional development, given the fact where we're discussing him. He was a psychosocial theorist. And if you have stages, you see breaks in development, so that's discontinuous. So yes, he had a discontinuous perspective of development. Whereas though Freud emphasized the early stages as being most critical and formative, Erikson, as we'll see as we proceed through adolescence and young adulthood and middle adulthood and late adulthood, we'll see that Erikson has a more lifespan focus. Some of the favorite phrases of the child in the autonomy versus shame and doubt stage capture where they are mentally. Favorite words might include no, even to things that they're interested in, or me do. So in the autonomy stage, basic independence, being able to toilet yourself, being able to feed yourself, being able to, in some degree, dress yourself, and so on. Initiative is a great expansion of abilities, including social expansions. So there's an eagerness to try all sorts of new things, to interact with peers. So our play, which before might have been parallel, now requires interaction and cooperation. The negative possible outcome would be guilt, particularly if parents, in terms of how they may redirect, maybe it's more of a punitive, critical thing, maybe criticizing, maybe a physical force, maybe shaming. So guilt probably not present unless, or at least minimally present, unless the parents are or caretakers are problematic in their approach. A child's degree of initiative in no small part relates to their degree of self-esteem. Now, most children tend to overrate their ability in terms of what they can eat. I can remember one Thanksgiving one, they have the entire turkey thigh, and obviously my grandmother laughed at that and showed me afterwards, you know, weren't anywhere close. So what they can eat, what they can lift, what they know. So very poor at estimating their own level of skills and abilities, which could potentially get them into dangerous situations. Now, how can parents support this initiative? How can parents contribute to self-esteem? Well, let's think back to Vygotsky and terms related to him for a moment, and then we'll continue. So perhaps the term zone of proximal development, that which a child can do with help. So instead of letting the child flounder and fail, parents can give a certain degree of give the child a certain degree of support. They can scaffold their abilities. Another thing that the parents can do, this might surprise you, is do not praise your child for smart. Oh, you're so smart. Praise them for effort. Because if a child does a task and fails, they might not be called smart anymore. They might enjoy being called smart. But if you always praise your child for, oh, you work so hard, I am so impressed, even if they fail at the goal, they still did the effort. So maybe in college, the outcome is more important than the effort. But for children that are developing, research is clear. Praise effort, not smartness or intelligence. Let's now consider preschoolers' emotional understanding. Preschoolers can do a lot of things in terms of moral and emotional understanding. They can be tested and shown how they know how somebody feels if they're sad or angry. They can also understand the cause of emotions. They can also feel empathy and sympathy, particularly if the person is seriously injured versus has a little boo-boo. Experiments have looked at that. They will offer comfort to somebody in distress, reflected in the picture. Interestingly, they also dislike someone if that person treats another person badly. Now, take a look at this clip I've attached. It really does relate to infancy, not early childhood, but I want to show you how early the understanding of morality develops and how it can be studied experimentally, do not be surprised if you see a question on your lecture quiz on this. If you watch it from the beginning until about 4 minutes, you'll be able to answer the question. If you want to watch more than that, full clip of 12 and a half minutes, great. If not, you'll be good if you watch at least the first 4 minutes. And perhaps it'll even be a bigger question, perhaps on the test. Haven't decided yet. I would also say, as I look more at this study, which I like a lot, it may make a wonderful short answer question for test 2. Let's assume that you as a parent want to encourage empathy and sympathy in your child. Not all people do. I was watching an interesting show last night. Stanley Tucci, he travels to different provinces of Italy, and they were talking about the northern province of Italy that some people want to go separate from southern Italy. In many countries, the north is the economic powerhouse and has to support the southern states, a little bit similar to the U.S., where the north, we pay more taxes, federal taxes, than we receive back, versus the south pays less federal taxes and receives more. But in any case, the proposed separatists of the one province of Italy is suggesting that when immigrants are in the sea, well, if they can't make it to land, let them drown. I think his parents fell short on the empathy and sympathy goal. But more back to our course, if you as a parent demonstrate empathy and sympathy, if you teach your child kindness to people, to animals, if you intervene when you see a child, even somebody else's child, or particularly your child, is being unkind to others, in many communities, it takes a village to raise a child, and in many communities this idea still remains, or at least, and sometimes it's now the neighborhood. And helping children to learn about emotions by labeling them, you're upset, you're sad, you're angry, you're frustrated. So labeling emotions and help to explain so they can understand, these can all help parents to create a child that has empathy and sympathy for others. And right now with the mass shootings, I think empathy and sympathy needs to be instilled in all children. So let's consider sexual development in early childhood. Freud thought that we were sexual beings in all stages of life, and modern theorists would agree on that, but not the same as the way adults would consider it. Physical feelings that are sexual, in other words, genital related, are not interpreted in the adult's way. So if something feels good to them, it would be the same as maybe a spray on your sunburn feels good. They would interpret that as being sexual, or that warm water might feel good on your back. Again, just because something's physically pleasant in terms of the genitalia, young children don't consider that to be in any way sexual. Now, boys and girls have erections. Boys, or persons identified male at birth, or for people identified as female at birth, typically girls, will have vaginal lubrication even before birth. So the body's already starting to respond in a sexual manner. Again, even though the child would not ever, at that age, consider it to be. A child's stimulation of the genitals is done for different reasons than an adult might. It might be done for comfort, to relieve tension or fear. There's no goal of orgasm or even understanding or knowledge that such a thing exists. Parents should know that self-stimulation and curiosity about bodies is a natural part of everybody's childhood. So if a parent maybe walks into a child in their bedroom and the child self-stimulating, the parent's reaction is very important and can have a lifelong impact. Horror, screaming, yelling, problematic, traumatizing. So maybe the parent will talk about behaviors that are okay in public versus private. You don't shower in public, do you typically? Unless they have a public pool, fine. Perhaps you don't go to the bathroom in public, or you don't whatever in public. So teach them public versus private. And also start introducing proper terminology. So at a certain point, the term penis should be introduced, and sooner rather than later. Now, I find it interesting when I teach human sexuality, everybody can identify the penis, that's a penis. But if I ask my students who are 18 or in their 20s, 30s, 40s, what is the term for a female's outer genitalia, which you should be teaching the girl, most are at a total loss, or they give me a totally wrong answer, the vagina. The outer genitalia is the vagina. No, a vagina is a collapsed tubular structure. So the girl should be taught that her outer genitalia is her vulva, V-U-L-V-A, vulva. So that includes the outer labia, the inner labia, the clitoris, the perianum, the vaginal orifice. So teaching proper terminology is important, because how will the child be able to communicate? And also, if a part of the body is so something wrong with it that cannot be named, cannot be spoken aloud, like from Harry Potter, you cannot speak the name aloud. It's kind of conveying a message. It's also good at this point to start telling the child that other people cannot touch this area, and that parents should be alerted if other people are trying to touch this area. So this is all part of, hopefully, normal childhood education. I decided to go back and add one concept on this particular slide, because we know that little boys and girls are often very interested physically in terms of the differences and in terms of role differences, and often they'll accept an explanation. It's like, oh, and move on. But if a child keeps asking that same question about differences in perhaps boys and girls, or focus on the genitalia, and they don't accept the answers, that could be problematic. If they're asking a lot of questions which are unusual, reflecting unusual knowledge, maybe focused on masturbation, any of these could indicate just general turmoil in child and stress, or they could actually indicate something much more problematic, that maybe the child is being sexually interacted with either a child or an adult. And if they're being interacted with sexually, by our viewpoint, of a child of similar age, that would maybe suggest that that child has been interacted with sexually by somebody else. So a certain degree of absolutely normal, but if children aren't accepting answers or they are overly focused, that could be a warning sign. Our next topic will be play, starting with gender preferences in play. Now, many of our topics cross cognitive, physical, and socio-emotional development, so play has all three. The topic of parenting. Clearly, I hope parents are not only looking for the socio-emotional development of their child, but also protecting and promoting physical development and cognitive development, and so on. So again, rather than hitting a given topic in all three topics, we're going to just shunt them to the one that seems to make the most best. And sometimes it's very close in terms of where a particular topic should land in that particular age. But anyway, let's go back to where we were. Gender preferences in play. To generalize, girls more often like socio-dramatic play. Characters taking care of one another, looking after one another. Boys, especially rough and tumble play, where objects with wheels are being flown about, rolled about, and so on. But both promote emotional understanding, and both can promote self-regulation, the control of one's emotions. So this slide shows most of child play types. Look at each one and see if you can determine the nature of it. Some you might not be able to tell, for example, the difference between unoccupied versus onlooker. So take your best guess, and then we'll consider them each in the next slide. Let's build on the concept of imaginative play introduced in the previous slide. You should know that imaginative play is also called pretend play or make-believe. So pretend, make-believe, imaginative, we'll all use interchangeably. Surprisingly, beginners or not, begins as early as a year and a half to 24 months, depending on the child. So the teddy bear can be a character, the puppet can be a character, the unicorn can be a character if it's an older child, and so on. There can be two-headed monsters and blue hippos, whatever. So we would expect this to occur. If we see it not occurring, it should be one of those milestones we should be looking at in terms of possibly indicating a developmental delay or autism. Now, this make-believe, pretend, imagine play is important to both cognitive learning as well as the socio-emotional learning, and will help the child to acquire better self-regulation. They can start putting themselves in the places of other beings, whether it's the blue hippo or in the bottom, maybe a pirate. Now, a little later on the process, beginning 4 or after, sociodramatic. This, you need another person who's going to be in on the plot line with you. So it might be the teddy bear who's going to be your patient, or it might be a fellow pirate. But anyway, coordination with others, either humans or other make-believe beings such as teddy bears. So let's consider the concepts or constructs, if you prefer, of sex and gender. Sex, male, female, or perhaps intersex. It is a biological classification, usually determined quickly and easily in the moments after birth. Intersex, if you're not familiar with that term, means a person was born with unclear, with ambiguous genitalia. And a lot of students go, oh, both? No, not both. So the doctors and medical people might look at that structure. It's not clearly a penis. It's not clearly a clitoris. Maybe it looks more like a clitoris, but has a urethra at the end, or maybe it looks more like a penis, but doesn't have a urethra. Maybe there's a vaginal opening, which is very short and is dead-ended. So intersex is more like neither rather than both. Now, gender is a social construct. Is this person a man, a woman, trans, or perhaps they prefer trans man or trans woman, or maybe they prefer just man or woman. Whatever that person prefers, you should obviously go with. It is a social construct. It varies by culture to culture, even by point in history to point in history within a culture. In many cultures, it has very strong expectations that go with it. What's appropriate for a boy, what's appropriate for a girl. For example, in some areas of the Middle East, playing soccer is totally inappropriate for a girl. Others, not a problem. So it has expectations. Now, most, but not all people develop a sense of gender identity. We'll discuss this more later. So let's consider the development of gender in early childhood. So at birth, children are assigned their sex, or it can be called the assigned sex or the assigned gender. That's all fine. Now, it's part of normal, typical preschool age development that children become increasingly interested in the differences between boys and girls, both physically and in terms of acceptable activities. In other words, what is acceptable for boys and what is acceptable for girls. In other words, gender roles. Now, in some cultures, there is a very distinct difference between what is acceptable for male and females. Maybe in one culture, farming is male, another culture, farming is female, and so on. But most cultures have a certain degree of distinction between male and acceptable female activities. Our culture is increasingly losing those distinctions. So either sex can cook or house clean or drive, and so on. Gender identity is usually followed by gender constancy. Gender identity is your idea that you are male or female, and yet that or does not fit everybody's experience, and it doesn't have to. So usually by the 3rd birthday, a child can say, I'm a boy, I'm a girl. Now, it usually matches their gender assigned at birth, their sex assigned at birth, but it does not have to. It does not necessarily match. But most children can self-identify. After gender identity, usually there's gender constancy. That's the idea that most children understand that the gender that they are is the gender that they will stay. Now, this totally ignores the trans person's experience, and we'll include them right here now. So some people are gender fluid, some people are agender, some people are gender nonconforming, all fine and good. But for the typical most common path is that if a person has this gender identity as female, she knows that she's going to stay that way. For most individuals of 4 or 5, they realize that once they are identified self by male, they will stay that way. So very typically, after the child has gender identity and they're developing gender constancy, there's often an avoidance of behaviors that are considered to be part of the other person's gender. For example, little boys are hesitant to do little girl things in particular. This is because before they get gender constancy, they think that behaviors determine our sex and gender, not physiology. So a little boy might think that if I put on a dress, I will become a girl. If I play girls' toys, I will become a girl. Because when mommy or daddy meet a stranger and correctly identify their gender, of course, mommy and daddy aren't looking at the person's genitalia. So the child is thinking of the cues that are used, such as, dress, long hair, short hair, purse, no purse, are the things that determine one's gender. So it kind of makes sense that they would be maybe hesitant to engage in behaviors associated with the other gender. Now consider by age 4 or 5, we said that children are learning gender constancy, and most children will usually follow the gender roles of their culture. And it's interesting that little boys in particular are shaped more by, and actually little girls too, are shaped more by dad than by mom. So usually the dad of many families is the one who keeps gender conformity and gender roles. So he's more likely to adjust a little boy's behavior who's looking at girls' dolls or girls' barrettes or girls' clothing. Moms are usually much more let the child play sort of thing. Many dads expect little boys to act in boy-appropriate ways, whatever that exactly means. And interestingly, if we look at girls' femininity, girls that are rated the most feminine usually have the most masculine fathers. Again, apparently dads are playing a much stronger role in this process than moms. Now, by age 6 or so, most children prefer to spend time with children of the same sex. They prefer, boys tend to hang out with girls. I'm sorry, boys tend to hang out with boys and girls tend to want to hang out with girls. Of course, there are many exceptions, but this is a typical pattern. Now, we mentioned gender roles, those roles that are associated with what do we expect a boy, the girl, what do we expect a girl to do, what do we expect men to do, what do we expect women to do. So how are these gender roles learned so uniformly? Well, we'll consider that on the next slide. But you might want to note that the gender role process begins often seconds after birth. Consider a study in which people are shown a baby dressed in either a young baby dressed in blue or pink, and they're asked to describe this child. Now, boy babies and girl babies look interchangeable unless you are changing diapers. So if that child is wearing blue, they'll say strong, active, and such and forth. That same child dressed in pink is delicate and pretty and so on. So just by looking at the cues given, people will start to differentially treat children, and parents unknowingly or knowingly play a role in this process too. So this process of learning gender roles and having expectations based on gender begins right after birth. By 5 or 6, most children prefer to spend the time with children of their same gender. Now, for a child that may be on the trans spectrum, they would prefer to spend time with children that are assigned the birth sex that they see themselves to be and experience themselves to be. So maybe a child that was assigned boy at birth who has trans feelings and may eventually move in the trans direction, that child may well want to spend time with girls or vice versa. So it's still consistent. So the gender that children perceive themselves to be is typically the gender that they wish to spend their time with. Now, by age 6 or so, most children prefer to spend time with children of the same sex. They prefer boys tend to hang out with girls. I'm sorry, boys tend to hang out with boys and girls tend to want to hang out with girls. Of course, there are many exceptions, but this is a typical pattern. Now, we mentioned gender roles, those roles that are associated with what do we expect a boy to girl, what do we expect a girl to do, what do we expect men to do, what do we expect women to do. So how are these gender roles learned so uniformly? Well, we'll consider that on the next slide. But you might want to note that the gender role process begins often seconds after birth. Consider a study in which people are shown a baby dressed in either a young baby dressed in blue or pink, and they're asked to describe this child. Now, boy babies and girl babies look interchangeable unless you are changing diapers. So if that child is wearing blue, they'll say strong, active, and such and forth. That same child dressed in pink is delicate and pretty and so on. So just by looking at the cues given, people will start to differentially treat children, and parents unknowingly or knowingly play a role in this process too. So this process of learning gender roles and having expectations based on gender begins right after birth. So in chapter 1, we touched on a lot of theoretical perspectives, and I didn't really want to overwhelm you, but I thought we'd wait till it was more appropriate to really delve deeper into the learning theories. So let's just do a brief review of learning theories and see which are applicable to learning of gender roles. Now, we talked about habituation already in the course. We said learning to ignore. Like, remember the studies in which we try to see, can the baby distinguish this sound from that color from that, this face from that? So we'll use the habituation procedure. So we'll expose them to the same thing over and over. They get bored. We'll sneak in something new and different to see if they can tell. If they remain bored, they can't tell them apart. But if their interest peaks back up, they can tell those two sounds or those two faces or those whatever apart. Now, social learning, you probably had a theorist's name that you learned in intro psych and probably a very famous experiment. Try to think of either that experiment or the theorist. Well, you might be thinking of the famous Bobo doll experiment. And the theorist, his name definitely began with a B. Hopefully you're thinking of perhaps, not pictured below though, Albert Bandura. So social learning, when a model is observed and then imitated. So it's also called not only social learning, but learning through imitation or learning through modeling. Or to make it more complex, sometimes it's called cognitive social learning. Okay? Classical conditioning, when two stimuli are paired over and over, and one of them has to be a stimuli that induces a reflexive behavior. So you might think of in Pavlovian conditioning, the bell and the meat, two stimuli were paired over and over. And remember, classical conditioning requires a reflexive behavior. Now, do you remember the other name for classical conditioning? Hint, it reflects the individual's name. On you for saying Pavlovian conditioning? Great. So classical, same thing as Pavlovian. Operant conditioning, that is when behaviors are either reinforced or punished. Which theorist below? Hopefully you're recognizing on the far right, B.F. Skinner. Now I didn't mention the theorist in the middle. Remember with little Albert. Hopefully you might remember John B. Watson. And was he a classical conditioning guy or an operant? Hopefully you're going with classical conditioning. So we've attached 3 names. We've learned alternate name for some of these. So take a moment and decide which types of learning do you think would be involved in the learning of gender roles. So habituation, learning to ignore unchanging stimuli, no, not appropriate. Social learning, when a model is observed and imitated, absolutely, definitely. So maybe imitating daddy cooking or mommy cooking, pushing around their little fake lawnmower around the house, easy bake oven, what have you. So social learning, absolutely positively. How about classical conditioning? No, that's reflexive behaviors, no choice. Pavlov's dog, for example, can't decide not to drool on conditioning day. So that's just to do with reflexive behaviors. Operant conditioning, we said, or in other words, I don't know if we did say it, instrumental conditioning, the same thing. Reinforcement of certain behaviors or punishment of others. Oh, absolutely. For example, we know that dads tend to punish perhaps boys that engage in stereotypically feminine behaviors. Or maybe dad rewards the girl when she puts on lipstick like mommy, but maybe punishes the little boy when he puts on lipstick like mommy. So operant conditioning through reinforcement and punishment, absolutely. Classical conditioning, absolutely not. Social learning, absolutely positively. And habituation, basically, absolutely not. So habituation, learning to ignore, definitely not relevant to gender roles. Social learning, when a model, such as a parent, sibling, character on TV, what have you, is imitated, absolutely. Classical conditioning, requiring the presence of reflexive behaviors, absolutely not. Operant conditioning, which involves punishment of correct behaviors, perhaps in one family, gender-conforming behaviors, maybe reinforcement, rewarding of behaviors typically associated with that gender, especially in cultures that have strong gender role differences between the sexes. Okay, absolutely. So by far the only one that does not apply, well actually the only two that do not apply would be habituation and classical conditioning. Hopefully that was easy for you. If not, just review it and think about it, and it will be. So let's see how you did on this review activity. Ivan Pavlov, he'd be the second from the left in the black jacket. Albert Bandura would be the more modern picture. He just died in 2021, far right. B.F. Skinner with his pigeons. And John B. Watson with the humorous, somewhat humorous side, saying, I don't always scare babies, but when I do, it's in the name of psychology. Now, in terms of the type of learning, social learning, Albert Bandura, classical conditioning, Ivan Pavlov, but also John B. Watson, operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner, instrumental conditioning, well, same thing, so B.F. Skinner, Pavlovian conditioning, named after the discoverer of classical conditioning, Ivan Pavlov, but since John B. Watson did classical conditioning / Pavlovian conditioning studies, also associate with him too. Learning by imitation, the famous Bobo doll experiment by Bandura. In terms of definition, learning through reinforcement and punishment, that is at the heart of operant / instrumental conditioning. Learning through reflexes, pairing the basically the US and CS, remember the unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus. Hopefully that doesn't bring back nightmares of intro psych. That would be the Pavlovian / classical conditioning. and learning by watching a model imitating, such as in the famous Bobo doll experiments. And if you need to do that a few times, don't be afraid to. Most people develop a clear sense of being male or female, but that certainly does not describe everybody's experience. Some people experience fluctuations, feeling more male sometimes or more female other times. Other people may not feel a strong feeling of gender at any time. So not everybody develops gender identity. It's often, but not always, consistent with one's assigned sex at birth. If it is consistent to the sex assigned at birth, I'll pause here, notice, alarming the dogs. I had a guess, so the doggies were doing their job. During COVID, when I was teaching live, my students got to meet my foster dogs. These two are, I fostered through Hope Rescue, which I highly recommend if you don't have the time or the life or the space to have a dog. You can assist rescues and be helpful. So anyway, let's see. So we said that the gender is often, but not necessarily always, consistent with the person's sex. Now, if you're assigned a sex at birth and your gender identity matches that sex, believe it or not, there's a term for that. It's cis. You are cis or you are cisgendered. Now, people who are assigned one sex at birth, but that does not match their gender identity, they're somewhere on the trans spectrum, and there's quite a few different names, and of course use the term that the person prefers. We should also note, and we mentioned this before briefly, not everybody has a fixed gender. Some people are descendants of gender fluid. It varies somewhat by day to day. And not everyone has a singular unified sense of gender, so they might prefer they or them, or maybe they with a ZE. So again, it's okay to ask, it's okay to share your gender. So in terms of the development of gender identity, both nature and nurture have a role. So nature includes prenatal testosterone, either the presence or lack thereof, which can influence gender identity and gender-related behaviors. Now, you might have noticed that there are many more trans people currently than in the past. Part of this is recognizing that people are trans and people are more inclined to realize it and to come out. In the past, there was no one that a trans person could turn to. There was no community. Now we have the internet, which is great in terms of finding community and people that are like you. But in the past, there are many more trans woman, trans female people than trans male. And it's currently, in the last maybe 5 years, flipping. So people that were assigned female at birth but have a male gender identity, in other words, trans men, are much more common. And I find it interesting that so many people muse when they're talking about it in terms of perhaps why. Well, during graduate school, one of my concentrations was endocrinology. And so if you take a male brain and have male hormones, the person's still going to be typically male in the behavior and the identity and so on. But if you take a female brain and you expose that female brain to testosterone, that can influence things like gender identity, gender roles, and so on. And there are chemicals in the environment which are called endocrine disruptors. They act as testosterone. So I would propose, and research is starting to suggest that we're seeing many more trans men because of the role of these endocrine disruptors. Now, in terms of nurture effects include culture, parents, siblings, peer, media that influence gender and gender consistent or gender non-conforming behaviors. Some cultures believe that there's large innate differences between men and women, others not nearly as much. The U.S. is somewhere in the middle, but moving towards the direction of trying to minimize differences. If you consider the Scandinavian countries, They're some of the countries with the least distinct gender roles. I was recently watching an old Adam 12 episode with my father. I go over there and watch old TV with him sometimes. And at that point, in the late 60s and early 70s, the only police officers in the forces were meter maids, so they had no active duty per se. And obviously there were no women in the military. Now in the U.S. we do have women in the military, women police officers, women firefighters, and so on. Consider a culture that is has very distinct gender roles, that of Saudi Arabia, also a particularly oppressive society. The picture of the person below, Lujan Hathali, and I'm probably mispronouncing her name, she was one of the women who led the battle for women to be able to drive vehicles in Saudi Arabia. That was not a right. So at this point, women can drive in Saudi Arabia, largely due to her efforts. She was jailed for it. Due to the efforts of President Biden, she was released for jail, and now she's in house arrest, which is still better than jail. So again, societies can either maximize or minimize gender differences. Now, in the past, for example, when I was an undergraduate, there were many more well-documented gender differences. Females had greater verbal ability, males had greater math ability, amongst the most robust. Current studies are simply not finding these differences as society accepts people assigned male and people assigned female can do the same sort of behaviors, can aspire to the same jobs and the same roles. We're seeing smaller and smaller effects to the point that they have disappeared, at least most of them. A few gender differences do remain. Differences in friendship. Of course, friendships are universal, hopefully, but female friendships tend to be smaller, more intimate groups. Male friendships tend to be wider and more shallow. In terms of aggression, we used to say males are more aggressive. Now we're tempering that. Both genders are aggressive, just differently. Males are more likely to use physical aggression. Both sexes are more likely to use social aggression. Trans children may experience a psychological disorder called gender dysphoria. It's an intense distress when their biological sex does not match their gender identity. Many parents reject their trans children emotionally, others even physically, leaving them homeless. A very significant portion of homeless youth are either gay and or trans. In some states, it is a crime for parents or physicians to provide gender-affirming care, and a real outcome in many of these situations is suicide. The map on the right shows states in which gender-affirming care is legal and is being protected. And you can see that would mean that in most of our states, it is not. In 2015, when gay marriage became legal in this country, many LGBTQ plus people and their allies were overjoyed and thought that discrimination would slowly subside against the LGBTQ plus population. But in the last few years, there's been a massive ramping up against I'll just say gay legislation and violence. For example, in 2023, 75 different anti-LGBTQ plus bills actually were passed. So again, last year 75 alone were passed, and the most common single category of 21 of those were specifically focused on gender-affirming care for transgender youth. And again, placing trans kids at huge risk of psychological harm, such as gender dysphoria, or even at risk of suicide. And again, research is definitely not supporting this line of legislation. As of the time of the construction of this particular narration for this slide, 23 states have laws against providing children gender-affirming care, and that affects about 1 in every 3 children that are trans. Let's consider culture, variables related to culture, and parenting, starting with SES. Take a moment. Do you know the acronym? Hopefully you're saying in your mind, socioeconomic status. It's very similar to class, but it's a preferable term and it's more encompassing. SES and culture strongly impact parenting styles. We'll consider parenting styles a few slides down the road. African American, Hispanic, and Asian parents tend to be more authoritarian in their style as compared to authoritative. Again, terms to be explained very soon. Immigrants often, and lower SES individuals, are more of a part of a collectivistic culture, and collectivistic cultures emphasize obedience and compliance, and also a focus on what is good for the good of the, particularly of the family versus the individual. Mainstream American culture is individualistic. We're focusing on what is good for us. So the decisions are made in terms of job, in terms of school, in terms of where you live, often based on what's good for you, not necessarily what's best for your entire family unit or community. So these factors, again, can strongly impact in parenting styles. So we're leaving the topic of gender and gender nonconforming and trans youth and entering the topic of parenting, though hopefully it's easy to see how we can still connect the two. Many of my own students have shared that my gender nonconforming or gender fluid students have shared that they cannot use their correct name. They're forced to use their dead name. They have to conform to their parents' expectations to even be permitted to live in the same house. So again, it's very easy to connect these two topics. But again, we're moving on and looking at parenting in general. So this slide is going to introduce you to the 4 major parenting styles associated with the researcher Baumrind. Take a look at each of these 4 terms, and then we'll move on to the next slide in which we'll discuss them a little bit. The previous slide alluded to parenting styles, so let's discuss it now. Baumrind offers the most accepted and used parental style model. She mentions 4 styles: authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, and uninvolved. Let's see what's involved in each one. They differ in 2 dimensions, the dimension being warmth and obedience/control. Maybe when you think of the word authoritarian, you think of an authoritarian government which heavily controls the people, jails dissenters, and so on. We probably have a negative connotation, and for some reasons, perhaps you should. The authoritarian parents are high in control. The child is supervised. They know what's acceptable and what is not. Obedience is stressed and expected. These parents are also low in warmth. The child tends to fear the parent more than respect them. This parenting style is more common in Black families, Hispanic families, and Asian families, and it's also much more common in immigrant families. Now, maybe a separate word regarding immigrant families. Negative outcomes have been associated with authoritarian parents, but far less so for first-generation people whose parents are, and they perhaps, anyway, when their parents are from another country that it's authoritarian parenting style, the child often does not suffer the negative effects in which other American children would have with this parenting style. So maybe a difference between those 2 cultures might be worth learning and noting. So let's consider permissive parenting next. Permissive parenting is low in control and high in warmth. The parent is more like a friend than an authority figure. Big problem. Many parents think this is the desirable parenting style where you're your child's friend. Well, no, the child probably has friends. The child needs a parent. Children with this style may fail to learn self-discipline. They're controlled by others, not by their own morals and judgments and values. And they also may feel insecure because they don't know the limits, and they might feel inclined to be constantly testing limits. Now, a word that's similar to authoritarian is authoritative, but very different in outcome and style. An authoritative parent is high in control. They have expectations, but they're also highly warm. And by far, the best outcomes from American-born children of non-immigrant parents is associated with authoritative parenting. Now, the last one obviously is not desirable, uninvolved. This parent is low in control and low in warmth. Basically, they're a non-parent, but technically the parent. The child often runs amok, gets involved perhaps with the wrong crowd of kids, often does very poor academically, and is a high risk of becoming a PINS child. And I don't know if you know the term PINS. It's a social services term and a judicial term. Persons in need of supervision. So since the parents are failing so overwhelmingly in their task, the court system has now stepped in. And if this is not corrected, they're also more at risk for conduct disorder, oppositional disorder, and maybe a lifetime of antisocial personality disorder. So not necessarily the outcome, but certainly greatly increased risk. So now we know the two major dimensions, warmth versus control and obedience, and the outcomes associated with each parenting style. Take a moment, if you will, consider your parents or whoever raised you. What style did they have? And it's certainly possible one person might have one and the other parent had another. And if you do plan on having children, or if you don't, what style do you think you would lean towards? As you may wish to suspect, the person on the bottom right is indeed Diana Baumrind, whom we are referring to in the parenting style slides. She is considered to be the authority on parenting styles. So some parents will explain the reasons behind the rules. That's referred to as inductive reasoning. For example, don't hold the bagel in the palm of your hand when you cut, otherwise you might get a nasty cut. Other parents will just say, do what I say or do it, or no back talking. Which type of parent is most likely to use the inductive reasoning? And remember, two parents are very low in control and rules, so it probably wouldn't be one of them. So you're probably thinking it's either authoritarian or authoritative, and you would be right. And some students mix up authoritarian and authoritative. Here's an easy way to think of it. Think of an authoritarian government as being very bad. It controls the people, it represses the people, it's a bad place to live. So authoritarian is the is a highly controlling parenting style and very unwarm. So it wouldn't be the government-related term, the authoritarian. It'd be the other one, authoritative would be the answer. Let's consider the problems specifically with physical punishment. Now, punishment does not have to be physical, it can be verbal, obviously, but let's focus on physical punishment. It can create strong negative emotions towards the self and towards the parent. If you consider the parent, what sort of emotions? Probably first fear and then maybe anger. It models aggression. It says that it's okay to hit somebody if you feel you're right or you feel you're bigger. Now, what happens when your parent is old and frail and now that child that used to be physically disciplined is angry with that parent? tables might turn. If you look at most bullies, almost every bully received physical punishment in their home by one or both parents. And physical punishment is bad for not only the child being physically punished, but for those around them. Consider bullies. Bullying is obviously bad for the victim, but it's also very bad for the bully. Research generally suggests that by age 21, most bullies have spent time in jail. So clearly it did not serve them well, and clearly being victimized by a bully does not serve anyone either. Which parenting style is most likely to use physical punishment? Consider that for a moment. Well, clearly if they're using physical punishment, they're controlling, and clearly not warm at least at that moment if they're using physical punishment. So it's back to is it authoritative or authoritarian? So if you think of the phrase authoritarian government, that's the negative one that physically punishes and sometimes tortures, sometimes kills. Anyway, so is that mnemonic? And this is a mnemonic. It would be the authoritarian style parenting. Now, occasionally you get authoritarian parents that will quote the Bible and say, well, spare the rod, spoil the child, which is actually not a Bible phrase at all. It's actually a 16th century poem by Samuel Butler, and I put down below. So, not biblical. So, staying with the topic, for a person who might be Bible-oriented and authoritarian, spare the rod, spoil the child. But consider this particular well-known phrase. The rod it refers to is the rod carried by the shepherd to guide the animals, not to slam them. So again, not the definition of rod that people sometimes incorrectly associate with physical punishment of children. So hostile teasing, verbal, hitting, physical, malicious gossip designed to hurt feelings, relational, kicking, physical, social excluding, like not having the person sit with you, getting and leaving if they sit with you, having everybody over except for them, definitely relational, breaking their toy. Well, physical is not only physically harming somebody, it could also be harming objects. And as an aside, people that intentionally harm animals are also very likely to harm children or their domestic partners. Off that subject, threatening, clearly verbal aggression, name calling, verbal aggression, and friendship manipulation. I will be your friend if you don't do this for me or say that or whatever. Definitely relational. So we saw that children that are physically disciplined are more likely to behave in an aggressive manner themselves. And some other children also, of course, do act aggressively too. Aggression tends to take three forms in children: physical, verbal, or relational. Consider these examples and see if it jumps out at you which is which, and then double check with the answer icon. So we saw that many topics in these three modules could be placed equally well in any one of the three domains rather: physical, cognitive, or socio-emotional. Parenting is clearly one, and so is child maltreatment. That being said, let's look at the basic forms of child maltreatment. Physical abuse, behaviors that inflict injury. Unfortunately, it could be using a belt to the point that it leaves welts, using the hand open-handed, which leaves a mark, cigarette burns, other things, so physical injuries, broken bones, internal injuries, skull fractures, just all terrible things, of course. Sexual abuse, any sort of sexual interaction with a person that's too young to consent. So it could be leaving porn around intentionally so the child might find it, sharing porn with them, showing porn, touching, intercourse, anything that runs the gamut, any sort of sexual interaction with a person too young to consent. So these are both active behaviors. Abuse means really active. Emotional abuse are behaviors that are done, doesn't have to be intentionally, but done that result in harm. So specifically isolating the child, maybe intentionally not letting them go to school specifically so they will not be around other children, or keeping them constantly locked into a room. Unreasonable demands in terms of things appropriate for their age. Demand they tie their shoe when they're not old enough, and then verbally berate them to the point of maybe tears when they're unable to do it. So requiring things that they're not capable of doing, purposely humiliating them, intimidating them. Now, neglect, on the other hand, is not meeting basic needs. It could be food. It could be sending the child to school without proper clothing, even though the proper clothing is not there, or that the proper clothing is accessible and the parent maybe is not motivated to seek basic clothing. So sending a child out without gloves in our climate, again, not meeting their basic food needs. Having them go to school and they're very odoriferous because they're not having proper hygiene, which will cause obviously social rejection by the peers. So again, not making sure the child's basic needs are being met. Which one of these do you think is the most common form of child maltreatment by far? If you're thinking neglect, you're correct. Approximately 80% of all child maltreatment is neglect. Now, if you're going to be working with young children up through adolescence, you might be interested in taking our child maltreatment course. It's a SOC course, and it's often taught by Professor Adamany or Professor Calhoun, both very fun teachers. Let's consider common characteristics in child abusers and also a few common child characteristics. The child abuser tends to be immature and easily frustrated when they become irritated, when they become frustrated. They often blame others or maybe even physically take their frustrations out on others. So a bad day at work can result in abusive behavior towards the partner and or the children and or the dog. They often have unrealistic expectations about what a child is capable of a given age. So they become maybe enraged when a child doesn't do something when that child is just plain not able to do it. These are all very common characteristics. Let's now consider child characteristics. This way in no way implies that the child is in any way responsible for their victimization. But certain children are more likely to get targeted. Interestingly, sometimes only one child is targeted. That child might become the scapegoat. Children that are subject to abuse are more likely to have the difficult temperament as compared to other temperaments such as the easy or the slow to warm up. Disabled children, whether it's intellectually or emotionally or physically, disabled children are also much more likely to be abused by a parent, especially a parent that's easily frustrated. There's a misperception that the average child that's abused grows up to abuse their own children. While they are at significantly increased risk, the average abuser, most abusers in other words, do not grow up to abuse their own children. My own mother was an example of this. So once abuse or neglect has been documented, there's typically a social worker that's involved with that particular family, assuming the children can still remain at that particular family situation. But are there other resources? Most definitely. Healthy Families in America, it is, the slide indicates, is the leading source of in-home support for families that are at risk of abuse and or neglect. Now we're somewhat continuing with our violence theme, and I juggled the PowerPoint order quite a few times. There's no one perfect way. So next we're going to consider violence desensitization. Research has been conducted since I was in college, and there's a huge body of evidence that show that children and adults that get exposed to violence on TV, on media, get desensitized. They're not emotionally registering the way they should to real life violence. It becomes more acceptable, and it also makes both age groups more likely to engage in violence. The effect of watching violent TV and media and video games is big enough to place it in, consider this quote, known threats to public health. Unfortunately, many parents, through either necessity or just lifestyle habit, tend to use things like the TV or social media, games that students can play on their phones, devices, as basically babysitters, and not good cognitively for the child, not good socio-emotionally for the child. And you can see what the AAP says on desirable amount of exposure to screens of any kind. And just as a refresher, what did AAP stand for again? So the A's, is it American? Is it Association? Is it Academy? Well, hopefully you're tempted by the American Academy of Pediatrics. I see changes in my students which I don't regard as positive. In days past on the elevator, if there was a sign up, students' eyes, you could see them reading the sign. Now that seems to rarely happen, even if somebody's putting up the sign in their presence. In the past, students in the hallway would be chatting or maybe studying. Now, very rarely, it's usually students tapping on their devices. And according to research, much of the time that students used to study is now used to engage in social media. And especially in the last few years, students have scored the highest in anxiety and depression ever. So this is really a standout for previous generations. And we do know that high social media use is definitely associated with increased anxiety and increased depression, as well as the depression disorders and anxiety disorders. So it's definitely alarming trends. So I would ask that you maybe consider your anxiety and depression levels, and also consider the amount of time you have to study, and see if cell phones and social media in general are causing you personally trouble. And if it is, maybe make a game plan, maybe work with a success coach or a counselor, Sean, and see if you can get a game plan to get it under control if there might be a possible personal issue.